Welcome back to Fund Your Future with DRS, and today we're talking a little bit about building an emergency fund, which is such a crucial part of financial planning and just planning for futures, planning for unexpected expenses. There was a recent article that I'd found in CNBC that said that 56% of Americans would have a hard time covering an unexpected $1,000 worth of an emergency expense. And so obviously this is an important topic.
It's like almost the first thing people talk about when they talk about financial wellness, budgets, spending, all of those things, like financial gurus. Usually the first thing is, do you have an emergency fund? Right. And people, it's either yes or no. It is a pretty clear, it seems like a clear-cut thing, but then I think there's a question of like, well, how big is an emergency? What counts as an emergency? Sure. All of those things. And the article you've referenced is a great example. I know there's been a lot of studies recently. I think the one that caught a lot of people's attention was like that most people wouldn't be able to fund $400 worth of an emergency expense without putting on a credit card or selling something or borrowing something. There was all these caveats. I don't remember exactly what the study was, but it was one of the things that I think is really telling about studies like that oftentimes is it's not just people who are making less money. Income doesn't necessarily always play a role, and it can have a bigger impact, but it's people who are making lots of money still might be living paycheck to paycheck and not being able to handle a refrigerator dying or a car repair. And so, we talked previously about budgets and kind of knowing what you're spending. And you have those set life expenses that you know every month after month, but there are lots of things that happen infrequently, yes. Just randomly. I don't know. What for you counts as an emergency? What do you think of when you think of emergency savings? What would you tap into the emergency savings for?
I would say like any sort of unexpected car repair, like having to get, I don't know. Like maybe getting your tires replaced. I think for me, a lot of the emergency savings, I think of like either medical bills of either for myself or also for my pets.
Yep.
And pets are obviously another one of those things that can creep into the emergency savings.
Pets in general could just be emergency spend.
Emergency spending of, oh, this happened to me a couple years ago. My dog was chewing on a stick and we noticed that her chewing was sort of, not normal, and we had to take her in. She had a little piece of wood that was stuck in her gums, and it was like $400 to like have them go in and remove it. And it's just all these kind of things of life that creep up.
We have a running joke in our house that like anytime you take the car to the shop, it's $400. It doesn't matter what it is. Like that. Yeah. It makes sense. That's the minimum cost for labor or whatever, an hour of labor. But it's like those. I mean, clearly in some of these studies would qualify as an emergency, and I'm glad you talked about cars and auto and medical. I think both those things are things that are unexpected. I think housing sort of things oftentimes fall into that category.
And then there's the house part too, where if you rent, typically your landlord would cover those expenses, like you said, the dishwasher, refrigerator breaking. But obviously for those of us who own, or I actually was in a situation previous to this where we were renting, but my landlord would have us pay for the expense up front, and then he would reimburse us the next month. And so we still had to put up the money for whatever expense was. I think he just didn't want to have to do with like a lot of the hassle.
Oh, that's an interesting strategy. Like, did you get to like then pick like I get the appliance I want, or like if an emergency?
Well, we never had to replace any appliances when we were there.
Yeah.
I think there was a few things with like, carpet cleaning and maybe the washer dryer unit had, I think we had to have someone come fix it or something, but.
That's interesting. That'd be something you'd want to know going into the situation. So I have money set aside for.
It was nice that he was hands off, but at the same time, we had to know that we had to have the extra money.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I was thinking more about this leading up to our conversation today about when we talk about size of emergency fund. Would it be beneficial to know that, like, you know, the average vet bill is this amount, and so I'm going to have that amount set aside? It's $500 or $1,000 or whatever. I mean, yeah. I know I've thought about this with housing, especially. Like, our water heater was getting older. We just replaced it because I was like, I don't want to worry about the emergency of not having hot water. I mean, I feel like that is one of the key things of living in a house, is being able to have hot water. But knowing how much that, like, I have no idea how much a new roof costs. What if we had a hole in our roof? Like, should I have that amount saved, or a new, like, what's the difference between emergency savings and, like, planning ahead? Right. Like, you know you're going to get a new car in so many years. Right. Like what's the difference for you?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, for me personally, kind of what I've heard from different people just in terms of planning for emergency savings is having like at least 3 months worth of expenses saved up. And mostly that's for, I mean, at least in the government sector, there's not as much of a risk of being like laid off from your job, but obviously that's a real risk for a lot of people. And so, you know, if you look at your expenses and say, okay, we're spending about, say, $3,000 a month, then your goal should be to have at least $9,000 in sort of an emergency savings fund that you could put towards, if you were laid off from your job, then you knew that you could at least be covered a little bit on rent, things like rent and groceries. Or obviously if you had an unexpected expense come up with your health or your car, then you could put the money towards that.
Yeah, no, I think thinking about it in terms of what do you need to live? Yeah. Like, I think there's like a baseline emergency fund for a lot of people that, like, a lot of folks recommend, like having $500 or $1,000 that you can just pull out so that you don't have to put something on a credit card and go into debt. Or you can put it on the credit card, but you can pay off the credit card the next month. Yeah, exactly. I don't expect people, you just walking around with, you know, $10, $100 bills and throwing cash on the table. But yeah, I think that's, I was reading a book, because I only read personal finance books right now, it feels like, but the author referred to it as her noodle budget. Like, if I was only living on noodles, like what's, like, if I had to cut to the bare bone essentials of my budget for 3 months or 6 months, what would that be? And I think that can sometimes be a way to make it a little bit less intimidating. Like, yeah, I've got to pay my rent. Yeah, I've got to, you know, pay my mortgage or pay for my insurance or whatever those things are. But I could stop paying for Netflix, or I could not go out and have a drink with my friend.
Right, yeah, those basic life expenses, like you said, of, like, you know, mortgage or rent and groceries and keeping the lights on.
Yes. Yeah, trying to figure out what are the bare bones, or what could I kind of scale things back to? Because that was the other thing I was trying to think about in terms of how much to have in an emergency fund would be, what are those unexpected amounts? And like the different categories, the car, the insurance, or the health sort of things, the house sort of things. Like, what are the things, like big things that could happen? Because you're right, I mean, I think public sector employees tend to feel more safe in their employment. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, I mean, every time there's a recession, people, people could certainly get laid off and things happen. But when I'm trying to think about emergency expenses, like, what are the things that I want to make sure I have money available for? So it'll be annoying, I'll be frustrated, I'll be concerned, but I'll still be able to sleep at night. I'll still be able, that's what I always feel like with an emergency fund. It's like, it helps you feel a little bit more comfortable going to bed. Like I have one less stress.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's just having sort of money set aside that you feel like you can sleep at night. Like, say, if you're kids are obviously another big one too, with, hospital expenses, falling out of bed, kid breaks his arm and has to go to the emergency room. That's definitely an emergency expense.
Yes, no, kids amongst themselves are probably an emergency expense, and I know both of us have like that blind spot of like not having kids and not understanding what that expense looks like. But I'm certain that there are a lot of unexpected ER visits and or random expense. Somebody showing up like, I'm going to camp next week, or somebody's birthday party that I need to go to and get a present. I didn't have that in my budget, and so.
But I think kind of getting back to that whole thing of like trying to define emergency expenses, and obviously it's like you said, it's just about having enough sort of money set aside that you feel like you can sleep at night. But it's those unexpected things. It's not a vacation. It's not going to your like friend's bachelorette party. It's that, what if my car breaks down? What if my roof leaks? What if my kid breaks his arm?
Yeah.
That I can have some money set aside for this.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at.
And maybe it's that people combine, you have a fund
Yes.
that you use for vacation and for emergency funds, and you're like, okay, well, we feel that we have enough in our savings fund that we can comfortably, spend this small percentage of it for a vacation.
Yeah.
It's all depends on, it's, as we said, personal finance is personal.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was trying to get at, is like it seems unlikely that you're going to lose your job and your car is going to break down and your kid's going to go to the emergency room all at the same time. Yes, hopefully not. And so like if you're trying to plan for all of those emergencies at the same time, that could be really overwhelming. And I think that's why oftentimes that guidance is $1,000 or 3 months of pay or 6 months of spending or whatever. Just pick a number that you feel comfortable with, that you feel like will allow you to breathe a little bit easier.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I know I wanted to talk about, and oftentimes when people hear, like, if they don't have an emergency fund, it's like, I don't have any more money in my budget. Like, how can I set money aside for an emergency fund?
Yeah, that's a great one.
And that's part of the challenge when you do have that emergency, is that then you're having to put it on a credit card and pay extra in interest for. And so not having an emergency fund oftentimes makes your life more expensive. And it's hard to think about it that way, because I just don't have that money available. But I think that's one of the reasons it's usually the first piece of advice when people are talking about personal finance, is to be able to save money for other things, to be able to save money for retirement, or be able to save money for kids' education, or save money for a vacation. Yeah. You have to have that little bit of wiggle room in your budget. And so trying to figure out, we've talked about looking at all of your expenses, and that's part of what you have to do if you don't have the money for the emergency fund, is, are there some of these expenses I can trim, or can I stop paying for Netflix for a year and move that $20 and put it in my emergency fund?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just about really starting small. If you're kind of looking at your budget and going, oh gosh, I don't feel like I have a lot of wiggle room here, even if it's only $20 or $30 that you can set aside. And again, we talked about sort of that setting up those automatic transfers that makes it a lot easier. That way you don't have to think about it, but it just automatically happens that every month, $30 or $50 goes into a particular account, and you say, okay, this is going to be my emergency fund, and I'm not going to touch it. And that's just for, and maybe it's helpful for some people just to like list out sort of those possible things. Okay, I own a home. I could use this for home expenses, or this is for like possible medical expenses or things like that.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about, I have not ever done this, but I've heard people talk about for that emergency fund, setting it up at a different bank, like having the money transfer out because it takes 2 or 3 days to get the money back. I need to get this money to pay for that unexpected credit card bill.
Yeah.
And that way it puts a little bit of intentional friction there. Like sometimes you want to make things harder, like for your future self. Sometimes you want to make things easy for your future self, but sometimes you want to make things hard for your future self. And I think that's an interesting strategy. I don't know how effective it is for people, but I've read that multiple times recently, and I think that's part of, as you were saying, personal finance being personal. It's like figuring out what works for you, and if that's what you need to do, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Especially now with online banks, and there are lots of different ways to.
There's tons out there. I recently set up an account with Chime. One, because they have like a really good savings rate, and two, because I wanted to have like a separate account basically for like home expenses. So it's specifically for like the unexpected, like refrigerator breaking, but then also being able to save up for home improvement projects that we want to do. So for us, it's kind of like a joint purpose, if you will.
Yeah, I actually really like that way to think about it for different. I mean, as we were talking about with different types of emergencies, like I might be saving for a new car or a replacement for my vehicle, but then I can use that money to make a decision of, do I use it to purchase a new vehicle, or do I use it to repair some of the money to repair?
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I had never considered that as kind of like different ways to bucket your emergency fund, but also count it as savings.
Yeah. And so I think it's like, I'm kind of a visual person, and it's easier to be able to say, like, to kind of divide it up instead of looking at one big number in my savings account and going, oh gosh, do I feel like I have enough money to go on vacation or save for emergencies? It separates it into more visual buckets, if you will. I'm like, okay, this account is for home expenses, and then this account is for like an emergency like expense sort of thing of the what ifs.
That makes sense too when you're setting up your budget, like to really think about like this dollar amount is going to my residence, or this dollar amount is going to my transportation, and it covers kind of all of those things, because those bills or those expenses aren't very standard. They aren't happening every month or every week or sometimes even every year.
You want to share from a personal how you store your emergency fund? Or?
I was thinking about this. I haven't been very good about setting up like a specific account for that, but I try to keep a cushion in that makes me feel comfortable and safe. And I've talked to friends about this, and sometimes it's like everybody's got a different number that they feel like there, but early on in my relationship with my wife, for a couple of years, she wasn't in a school, or she was in school and not working. I was working, and then for a year, she was working and I wasn't working, and so we got really used to living off of one income, and so I think that helped us think about it differently. Like, what would we do if only one of us was working, or neither of us was working? Here are the ways we would kind of change our lifestyle and got into those habits. So yeah, I keep my emergency fund in my normal bank checking savings accounts, and don't necessarily segregate them as much as I probably should. But yeah, that's worked for me. And then knowing like what other, I'm gonna do some more research now though on thinking about like how big of an emergency could happen at my house, like, and what would that look like? Because hopefully folks have insurance, and like there are things that cover like health costs as well. Like I think a good rule of thumb is like for health stuff, you should have as much on hand as your deductible is. Like that, at least a starting point, like to be able to cover. So I being a newer homeowner and like getting closer, more into the adulting sort of phase of life, thinking about like what are like emergency when you're 22 is very different than when you're 42.
Totally.
And And I think that's people's emergency funds can probably change over time as well.
Yeah, yeah. But I think this it's important to start. It's okay that it's okay to start small.
Yeah.
And just to kind of go from there. And it can get really intimidating thinking about like, oh my gosh, I have to save for all of these things. But it's just important to start.
Yeah.
I think that's the main message.
Yeah. Start small, and then recognize or ask like, what is an emergency, and what would I be comfortable with, and what would make me feel a little bit better sleeping
Sleeping at night.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Seth.
Yeah, it was a good conversation.
Yeah.